Ever wonder if your Microsoft 365 retention setup is actually protecting your data or quietly working against you? If you've ever been blindsided by a sudden data loss or a compliance surprise, you're not alone. Today, we're unpacking why the difference between retention policies and records management could mean the success or failure of your company's compliance game. We'll break down real-world pitfalls admins hit every week and why most organizations are just scratching the surface of what Microsoft's Compliance Center can do. Are your compliance tools actually working together? If you've ever tried to untangle your compliance setup in Microsoft 365, you know it rarely feels seamless. It's more like trying to keep a dozen spinning plates going with one hand while someone else is adding new ones behind your back. Most people set up retention policies and records management in totally separate spots. You may end up with a retention rule in exchange for mailboxes, another for SharePoint files, and then add a records declaration for a set of legal documents somewhere else entirely. On paper, it looks like you're checking all the right boxes. In practice, following the life cycle of a single chat or email gets so confusing you're practically tracing red string on a whiteboard. Now try mapping out what happens to just one email thread. Let's say a message lands in an executive's inbox, gets replied to with sensitive data, is later added to a Teams chat, and finally the whole conversation is copied to a project site in SharePoint. If your retention policy on Exchange is set to delete after 5 years, but you've got a SharePoint policy for 7, and then someone accidentally applies a records declaration, the result is anyone's guess. Which rule wins? Does the message get preserved, deleted, or locked as a record? Most admins don't find out until they have to restore missing content or answer audit questions they didn't see coming. It stops being a compliance plan. It turns into a detective case. The real snag is that Microsoft 365 compliance tools often step on each other's toes, and it rarely becomes obvious until something breaks. I've seen large organizations discover leftover legacy policies applied to old mailbox groups. A new admin sets up an auto-apply retention label on sensitive files, while a different team adds a SharePoint site policy out of an abundance of caution. A year later, no one's quite sure what's being saved, what's at risk, or why legal feels like they're working in a funhouse maze. No one in Microsoft's splashy admin videos really talks about the landmines that come from these overlaps until you're smack in the middle of an audit or a legal hold. Suddenly, the tools you thought were quietly protecting your company become the very reason you can't find what you need, or worse, why key data is missing. Hidden conflicts mean files might get locked down too soon, or emails you needed for discovery vanish because two settings silently canceled each other out. It's a little like programming your home thermostat, ceiling fan, and a space heater to 3 different temperatures and wondering why the room never feels right. So how do you stay ahead of the chaos? Instead of thinking of each tool, retention, labels, records, as a separate, isolated control, you need to step back and ask how they work as a system. What's missing from most compliance playbooks is a view of how these rules overlap, which rules have higher priority, or how policy scoping actually works across workloads. Microsoft has documented the hierarchy, but let's be honest, nobody's reading that 50-page PDF unless they're already on fire. According to Microsoft's own documentation, retention labels and policies process data differently depending on the workload and their scope, and one can often override the other based on how and where it's applied. But many admins never see this play out until it's too late. Take a look at one real-world scenario that's come up more than once. A multinational company inherited 3 layers of retention logic. The first was an outdated exchange policy for executive mail. The second, a recently created label for GDPR compliance, automatically stamped on all project sites. The third, a records declaration that got added because someone misinterpreted a legal requirement. None of these rules actually matched up, and the system processed them based on order of precedence no one really understood. The result, data that was supposed to be on legal hold was wiped out in one part of the environment, and data everyone thought was gone kept hanging around because another setting quietly overrode it. One audit later, executive leadership wanted an answer, and the answers weren't pretty. If you want a mental picture, imagine walking into a conference room where every wall clock shows a different time. Meetings start, end, and overlap, and nobody really knows what's on schedule. That's what happens when compliance tools run independently in Microsoft 365, except the stakes aren't just missed meetings. It's regulatory fines, legal blowback, and a compliance program that's impossible to defend. At the end of the day, the biggest risk isn't missing a checkbox or forgetting a feature. It's misunderstanding how your tools interact all the way from Mailbox to Teams to SharePoint. If your settings aren't synchronized, you're building new blind spots every time you fix an individual policy. Seeing your compliance platform as a living system, not just a menu of toggles, is the first and most important step toward actual data protection. Of course, even if you start charting all the moving parts, there's one classic mistake that almost every IT team makes at least once, mixing up retention and records management. And that's where the really costly problems usually begin. Retention versus records, the critical difference most miss. Let's just say the number one compliance pitfall I see isn't about somebody forgetting to turn on a policy. It's about mixing up retention policies with records management. Way too many IT teams treat them as if they're just two names for the same tool. Retention, records, whatever. You apply a rule, your data's protected, right? Except that's the exact thinking that ends up costing organizations millions in avoidable legal headaches. At first glance, it all feels plug and play. Microsoft gives you retention settings across Exchange, Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, and the rest. Set it once, walk away, and let the cloud work its magic. For records management, it's either seen as the land of legal teams, the part nobody wants to touch, or it's implemented as a checkbox afterthought to cover some compliance buzzword. Here's where things start slipping through the cracks. When admins set up retention, they assume it locks down the data, keeps it for as long as they said, and deletes it when the time's up. But that's all about controlling containers, a kind of set the rules and forget the details approach. Records management goes deeper. It's not just about how long you keep something, it's about the moment something turns into a record and becomes immutable, locked so nobody can change or delete it unless a very specific process is followed. Records management tracks individual items through their entire life cycle, when a document should be declared a record, when it's locked, who touched it, who can dispose of it, and exactly how. It's the audit trail. The legal fallback, the guarantee that something didn't get overwritten at the wrong moment. The problem shows itself the first time you try to answer a legal or regulatory request. Say you slap a forever retention label on Teams chat history and walk away feeling like you've done your job. Months later, someone from the legal team needs to recover key messages tied to a regulatory dispute. Here's the twist. Because those chat messages weren't declared as records, users could still delete or edit them whenever they wanted. Your forever policy kept nothing safe. When the legal team opens up the case, all they see is blanks. I've seen financial companies burned by this exact scenario. Teams channels carefully labeled for indefinite retention, only to find out that nothing was actually enforced until records management stepped in. Key evidence lost. Compliance officer fuming. Millions on the line for failing to preserve data when it mattered. Industry experts constantly call out this gap. The latest Microsoft roadmap for Purview has started underlining the difference, highlighting features like item-level record declaration, disposition review, and lockdown compliance holds. Still, the old habits persist, often because so many compliance guides lump the feature sets together, or worse, skip over records management altogether if it's not a regulated industry. If you only use retention policies, you risk missing requirements around how records have to be declared, locked against edits, and finally reviewed before disposal. According to research, the majority of penalties in e-discovery audits aren't from not setting any policy. They're from having incomplete definitions of what constitutes a record and how it has to be handled when the time comes. IT and compliance teams wind up tossing responsibility over the fence, never mapping out where one feature stops and another needs to pick up. Here's another way to think about it. Using retention without records management is like locking your front door but leaving your windows wide open. Both say they keep you secure, but one only stops a problem if the other is actually closed. Both of these features speak the language of compliance, but they don't solve the same problems. Retention deals with how long. Records management asks, what's the proof that this couldn't have been changed? A policy on its own is simply not enough when an auditor asks for evidence that a record has been locked and managed throughout its entire lifespan. Most IT admins only realize they've missed something critical after a regulator comes calling or a long-running legal case turns up a gap in the data. By then, the damage is already done, key evidence is unrecoverable, trust in the compliance system is trashed, and leadership suddenly wants daily reports on record status. These are the situations where set it and forget it compliance costs real money, and rebuilding trust in your setup isn't a quick fix. So here's the takeaway. Retention and records management are not interchangeable, not even close. Retention automates bulk rules, great for archiving, good for data minimization, but it has blind spots by design. Records management is what you turn to when the stakes are highest, when every change, edit, and deletion has to be logged, preserved, and justified. Treating them as the same tool is the fastest way to end up with an audit or compliance nightmare that nobody saw coming. That raises the real question. If these features are so different and missing the distinction causes chaos, how do you line up your business requirements with the right tools in the first place? Mapping your needs to the Microsoft 365 compliance stack isn't as clear-cut as Microsoft's demo scenarios would have you believe, but that's where the payoff actually starts. A blueprint for mapping business needs to compliance features. If you've ever tried mapping legal requirements to Microsoft 365, odds are you've stood in front of a whiteboard, maybe with a handful of sticky notes, maybe with that overwhelmed feeling, trying to make sense of what connects to what. Every organization claims to have a compliance plan, but in the real world, it's usually more like a patchwork quilt. Your finance team has one set of rules, legal another, HR something totally different, and then there's a whole stack of government regulations on top. The honest truth, when you look at Microsoft 365's entire menu of compliance features, turning on everything you can becomes way too tempting. If something looks like it helps with risk, who wouldn't want it set up? But this is where things go sideways. Rather than building out a layered solution, what usually happens is people pile on retention labels, auto-apply policies, sensitivity tags, and legal holds until the whole system starts to feel slow and users wind up locked out of data, or worse, entire departments can't locate files they desperately need. Sometimes no one notices the tangle until the legal team needs data for a real case or a regulator turns up looking for proof that your processes are actually working. When that happens, all those overlapping rules turn into a headache that refuses to go away with more meetings. Part of the problem is that every compliance feature in Microsoft 365 comes with its own dependencies. Take retention labels. It seems simple. Classify a file, attach a label, and the retention timer starts. Except the scope of that label depends on where it's applied. Auto-apply policies need you to know exactly where your data is sitting, who owns it, and what sort of information it contains. Records, declarations, those work, but only when the data is actually classified for that scenario and the right users have permission to make it stick. If you don't understand how the features connect to your data's actual journey through your company, you're basically building a compliance puzzle with pieces that don't really fit. One healthcare provider I worked with wanted to simplify things by mapping both HIPAA retention and their own internal data policies under a single knockout retention policy. The intent was good, keep all their patient records, emails, and billing data around for exactly as long as the rules demanded, no more and no less. Exchange got the policy, SharePoint had it too, Teams was supposed to fall in line. Fast forward 3 months and the cracks started showing. SharePoint's idea of enforcing the retention period didn't match Exchange's, so some patient files were deleted early while other records stuck around past their legal shelf life. When the audit finally rolled around, nobody could say for sure what policy was even working at any given moment. The intent was there, but the execution fell short because the dependencies between workloads were never mapped out. Microsoft calls this out in their compliance documentation, emphasizing that your real job isn't just setting features, but actually translating every business or legal requirement into process architecture and controls. Yet, not many teams actually create those diagrams connecting which department owns which data, where it lives, and how their policies interact from Teams to SharePoint to Exchange. Most people try moving forward with broad strokes, hoping a set it everywhere model will be close enough. But what happens is the features start to step on each other. That's how you end up with files accidentally immune to deletion, or just as bad, auto-deleted because a new retention label silently trumped an older site policy. The rules you think you're enforcing get overridden where you least expect it, sometimes with no error message at all. So how do you build a blueprint that actually works? You start with the data, always. Classify it first. Decide which information is confidential, which is public, and most importantly, which is regulated by external requirements. Then draw the map showing exactly where each type of data lives. Is it hiding in OneDrive folders, bouncing between Teams chat, resting in SharePoint libraries, or scattered across Exchange mailboxes? Only after this, where does everything exist phase do you move to aligning your compliance tools. Instead of treating retention and records as an all or nothing play, decide which type matches each location. A SharePoint site with highly sensitive contracts might need record declaration at the document library, while a Teams chat full of project planning might be fine with a basic retention label. Most people never check for hidden dependencies. Let's say an admin applies a new retention label to a SharePoint document library because someone asked for stricter retention. What they might not notice is that this label, if more specific, quietly overrides the broader site-wide retention policy. The end user gets no warning and the old protection is simply gone. Features don't shout when they conflict. They just process data according to the underlying hierarchy. The payoff comes when your compliance map finally lines up with the way your business actually runs, not just the way Microsoft lays it out in a product demo. You get fewer blind spots, more predictable outcomes, and a fighting chance when someone asks, "Can you prove what happened to this data?" But even a well-built plan can turn fragile fast if you don't keep tabs on it. Things change, a new regulation rolls in, Microsoft ships a surprise update, or your business grows in ways nobody planned for. That's where ongoing auditing and regular tune-ups move from nice to have to absolutely required if you want your system to stay healthy. From setup to system, auditing and future-proofing your compliance. Ever get the feeling your compliance system is humming along, at least until a new rule drops or Microsoft rolls out an update that rewrites what retention means? It's that classic moment when you think you've hit steady state only to wake up to a regulation you've never heard of or see a feature quietly renamed in the Compliance Center release notes. Most admins set up compliance controls with the best intentions, maybe a few retention labels here, a record declaration there. Then they step back, cross their fingers, and hope the setup passes muster in the next audit. But the truth is, even well-planned policies aren't immune to drift. Business priorities change, departments launch new projects, and thanks to Microsoft's constant updates, the same configuration you trusted last quarter might not even work the same way a few months later. It's when things start changing in the real world that set and forget becomes set and regret. What used to be a tidy, logical retention matrix can sag under layers of expired policies, overlapping rules that nobody touches, and records declarations that just hang around because everyone's scared to clean them up. Stuff piles up in the background, labels you meant to phase out last year, auto-applied tags now landing on the wrong team's channels, or legal holds that survive long after the business reason disappears. Suddenly, it's audit time. The compliance officer is paging through policy lists and finds a retention rule for sales data, another that covers the whole marketing department, a third that somehow snuck in from a test tenant, and nobody on your team can say which one actually wins in a conflict. The result is a museum of accidental compliance with policies layered up like geological strata. You're not alone if you're unsure what's still relevant. In fact, industry surveys show that regularly auditing compliance settings is one of the most neglected areas in data governance, right next to documenting why you set a rule in the first place. Microsoft even bakes audit logs and policy health checks into Compliance Center, but most teams only crack them open when something is already broken. The irony here is that your compliance platform will quietly flag errors, missed configurations, and warnings before you notice them. But if you're not scheduling checks or reviewing those dashboards, these hints end up as background noise. Over time, missed alerts just become normal and gaps grow wider. The practical fix isn't rocket science, but it does take commitment and a willingness to do the unglamorous work. Schedule regular reviews of your retention and records management settings. Don't make it a once-a-year thing. Build it into your team's monthly or quarterly workflow. Open up Microsoft's reporting tools and actually spend time looking for where rules overlap, where records have gone orphaned, and which data containers now carry legacy settings that make no sense for today's business model. Don't limit it to IT either. Often, business units know about sensitivity around certain data before admins do. Bring in stakeholders from departments that actually create and use the data and ask them if the rules still fit their needs or if projects, departments, or compliance requirements have shifted. One tip I've seen pay huge dividends is to run tabletop exercises long before an actual audit or legal request. Gather your compliance, IT, and legal folks in a room and simulate a discovery request as if you were facing a regulator tomorrow. Pick a scenario, maybe an HR case, a customer data breach, or a GDPR data subject access request, and try extracting all the data you'd need based on your current retention and record settings. Most teams walk away from these exercises with a punch list. Retention periods that don't fit, data in Teams channels that's still editable after being declared a record, or SharePoint files that got deleted too early thanks to a rogue policy. The goal isn't to embarrass anyone, it's to surface the blind spots while the stakes are low. Future-proofing your compliance program means building in a feedback loop. Stay on top of Microsoft's roadmap and release notes. When a new compliance feature launches or when product names change or settings shuffle locations, circle back and review your blueprint. Map out what changed, make quick adjustments, and keep actual documentation for why a rule was set or retired. The teams who treat compliance as an active process, not a static checkbox, always fare better when disruption inevitably hits. All of this turns compliance from something that lives in the background into a living, breathing part of your Microsoft 365 environment. The more you refine, test, and audit your controls, the less likely you are to get blindsided in an audit or to lose that key record when a legal issue comes calling. A healthy auditing routine is the only way to spot bets you didn't even know you were making and realign your compliance plan before anyone else notices something's off. That leads to the ultimate question: how do you turn all this moving machinery into a compliance operation that actually holds up, even when Microsoft changes the rules and regulators start reading the fine print? If you've ever treated retention and records management as a checklist, you've felt how fragile that approach gets. The trick isn't chasing every new feature or toggling more settings. It's taking a step back to actually map out how these parts fit together in your workflow. Start by putting your risks front and center and build from there. Audit your system, find the weak spots, stop letting compliance tools drift off into disconnected silos just because you set them up years ago. Go through your Microsoft 365 settings this week, poke around and see where the system actually supports you and where it's just noise.